April 18, 1942. The horizon over the Pacific shimmered with the first hints of dawn. Japanese radar operators, confident in the invincibility of their defenses, reported nothing unusual. Yet above the endless blue, 16B, 25 Mitchell bombers rose silently from the deck of the USS Hornet, aircraft too large to normally take off from a carrier, pilots too brave to care. What they carried was not just steel and explosives, but a message that would forever alter Japanese perception of American power. They laughed at the carriers, yet they would soon witness a force they could not ignore. For months, Japan had consolidated its victories across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Malaya. Japanese military planners believed the American forces were shattered, their aircraft carriers crippled at Pearl Harbor, their industrial capacity diminished by distance and previous losses. In Tokyo, newspapers celebrated their nation's might, convinced that the United States lacked the reach or resolve to strike back. Yet in the northern waters of the Pacific, the USS Hornet and its escorting fleet sailed silently, carrying a dozen highly modified B-25s that would defy every expectation. The pilots selected for this mission were a unique breed. Men like Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, whose calm demeanor masked nerves sharpened by hours of training, led crews who understood the stakes. Their task seemed impossible: launch medium bombers from a carrier, a maneuver never before attempted in history. The modifications to the B-25s included extra fuel tanks, stripped interiors, and reinforced landing gear. Each plane carried a skeleton crew, a payload of explosives, and the audacity of an idea that could shake the foundations of an empire. As the Hornet approached its launch point, roughly 650 miles from the Japanese coast, tension gripped every sailor and pilot aboard. Sailors joked and smoked to mask fear. Pilots ran through final checklists in hushed monotones. Beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet and coastal defenses slept, confident in their invulnerability. They could not imagine that their adversary was about to strike at the very heart of the empire. The launch began under a sky streaked with pink and gold. One by one, the bombers roared down the flight deck, wheels barely touching the deck before leaving the safety of the ship behind. The Hornet's crew watched as each plane vanished into the clouds, each pilot carrying not just bombs, but the hopes of a nation. As Doolittle himself climbed into the final aircraft, he glanced at the Pacific below and whispered, "We're only just beginning." For the Japanese pilots stationed on Kyushu and Honshu, the first sight of the approaching B-25s was disbelief. Intelligence reports had discounted the possibility of American medium bombers in the Pacific, insisting carriers were too few, distances too vast. Radar blips went unheeded, dismissed as weather anomalies. Then the planes appeared over the cities, Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, dropping their payloads with surgical precision. Fires erupted, air raid sirens screamed, and chaos replaced the complacency of morning routines. In Tokyo, residents poured into the streets, bewildered and terrified. Factories that had hummed with activity were suddenly engulfed in smoke. Train lines were disrupted. Communications faltered as telephone poles burned and electrical transformers sparked and failed. Japanese military officers scrambled to mobilize defenses that had never been designed to counter threats at this range. Yet the raid was brief, 15 minutes, barely enough to unload destruction, yet sufficient to shatter illusions. The psychological impact was immediate. Pilots and civilians alike realized that the Americans were not defeated. They were not broken. They were beginning a fight that would escalate beyond any expectations of Japanese leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's crews, many exhausted and low on fuel, continued toward China, knowing they would likely crash land or bail out. Yet they carried a message of American reach, ingenuity, and daring. The raid proved that the United States could strike anywhere, defying assumptions that distance and prior losses had weakened the nation. Japanese military journals later reflected on the raid with disbelief and fear. Strategists who had mocked American aircraft carriers as relics now understood the capabilities they had underestimated. For the first time, the psychological certainty of victory that had guided Japan for months wavered. Pilots who had laughed at the Hornet and its B-25s now recorded in diaries the shock of a nation under attack from a foe they believed incapable of such audacity. Even the Americans were stunned by the raid's initial success. Doolittle himself noted in reports that while the damage was limited, the moral impact was immeasurable. Every pilot who took off from the Hornet knew that they had done more than deliver bombs. They had pierced the myth of Japanese invulnerability and demonstrated that the Pacific was no longer a sanctuary for the Empire. As word spread back through military intelligence channels, Japanese leadership faced a sobering realization. The war was no longer a distant fight in foreign colonies. America was alive, innovative, and determined, and it had only just begun to strike. The laugh that Japanese pilots had shared when mocking the P-47s in American carriers transformed into disbelief, then fear, then strategic urgency. The first phase of the Doolittle Raid had done what battles could not. It had reshaped perception, undermining confidence, and planting seeds of doubt in the heart of the empire. April 18, 1942. Tokyo burned in shock and disbelief. Yet the Americans were already vanishing into the horizon, leaving behind smoke, fire, and shattered illusions. Japanese radar operators scrambled to comprehend how 16 seemingly ordinary bombers could appear over their cities without warning. Doolittle's men were ghosts of vengeance, moving with precision and courage. But the true brilliance of the raid wasn't the destruction, it was the awakening it forced upon Japan. For the first time, they understood that the Americans were only beginning to fight, and that the reach of this force was far greater than anyone had imagined. The initial explosions over Tokyo sent shockwaves through Japanese command structures. Air raid alarms blared, factories ground to a halt, and civilian panic swept through the streets. Yet, unlike traditional attacks, the Doolittle Raid was not intended to occupy, conquer, or destroy vast swaths of territory. Its purpose was psychological, an assertion that American ingenuity could penetrate the heart of the empire. For the Japanese leadership, accustomed to seeing their homeland untouchable, this realization was catastrophic. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle and his crews had planned every detail meticulously. Their B-25s, heavy with extra fuel and stripped of unnecessary weight, relied on precision timing and daring execution. Each pilot understood that the moment they left the Hornet's deck, their mission teetered on the edge of impossibility. Over the Pacific, any miscalculation could mean disaster. Over Japanese soil, it could mean death at the hands of a formidable military. Yet these men moved with calm determination, the audacity of their actions magnified by the fear it instilled in the enemy. From above, the cities of Japan appeared orderly, structured, confident. The Japanese had been lulled into complacency by months of victories across the Pacific. Their radar systems, though effective, were unprepared for the low-altitude approach of American bombers. Citizens watching the sky had no warning, no time to prepare. The B-25 struck quickly, dropping bombs on factories, oil depots, and military installations. Smoke spiraled into the sky, and fire illuminated the early morning haze. Yet for many Japanese observers, the most profound shock was not the physical damage. It was the revelation of vulnerability. Back aboard the USS Hornet, the relief and tension coexisted in strange harmony. Sailors and crew members knew the raid had been a success in principle, but anxiety over the fate of the crews lingered. Radio silence had been maintained, and now every moment passed with heightened suspense. Over the Pacific, the 16 bombers were scattered, some heading toward designated airfields in China, others improvising due to fuel shortages. Each pilot carried not just ordnance, but the symbolic weight of a nation's resolve. In Japan, reports filtered back to military headquarters. The Americans had struck Tokyo. The city had never been attacked from the air, and the psychological ramifications were immediate. 4 Japanese pilots stationed in home defense squadrons. Disbelief turned to urgency. Fleets of interceptors scrambled too late. By the time they engaged, the bombers had vanished into the clouds. High-ranking officers, who had previously dismissed American capability, began drafting emergency plans to bolster defenses. They realized that the war was no longer confined to distant territories. The enemy could reach them, strike fear into their population, and undermine morale with precision and speed. Meanwhile, the crews who had struck Tokyo faced the perilous journey over China. Fuel reserves were dangerously low, navigation was complicated by unfamiliar terrain and adverse weather. Some pilots crash-landed in remote fields, risking capture by Japanese forces or friendly fire from local militias. Others parachuted into forests, their survival dependent on courage, improvisation, and the assistance of Chinese civilians committed to resisting Japanese occupation. Every step of their escape reinforced the dual nature of the raid. Physical destruction had been minimal, but the psychological impact was exponential. The raid's message rippled through Japanese society. Factories that had been confident in their invulnerability now implemented blackouts, air raid drills, and dispersal of critical assets. Civilians, who had trusted in the invincibility of the homeland, were forced to confront vulnerability and uncertainty. For the first time, Japanese leaders had to consider that their strategy of rapid conquest might not suffice against an enemy capable of strategic penetration and improvisation. Doolittle's men were seen as nearly mythical figures in post-war accounts. Lieutenant Richard Cole, co-pilot of the lead aircraft, later recalled, "We were scared out of our wits, but we believed in what we were doing. Every takeoff, every drop, every mile flown was a statement. America had not given up. We were only beginning." The very survival of the pilots, many of whom navigated hostile territory and landed with nothing but hope, served as a testament to the audacity of American military planning. Japanese military strategists, reviewing the aftermath, acknowledged that the raid exposed critical weaknesses. They had underestimated the Americans' reach, their willingness to innovate, and their ability to execute complex, risky operations. Radar networks, previously thought foolproof, had failed to detect the low-altitude bombers until it was too late. Anti-aircraft defenses, scattered and reactive, were insufficient. And the very fact that 16 bombers could traverse hundreds of miles from a carrier to the heart of Japan with such precision caused a re-evaluation of defense strategy. The Doolittle Raid thus accomplished more than a simple bombing operation. It was a psychological scalpel, slicing through the confidence of a nation that had believed itself untouchable. The laughter Japanese pilots had once shared when mocking American aircraft carriers or bomber capabilities was replaced with disbelief, fear, and a grudging respect. The raid demonstrated that American ingenuity could overcome technological, geographic, and tactical limitations, and that the fight in the Pacific had only just begun. Even as Doolittle's men moved through China, some captured by Japanese patrols and some aided by locals, the symbolic weight of their actions resonated throughout the Pacific theater. Allies celebrated, Axis powers re-evaluated, and the United States gained a moral victory that far exceeded the scale of destruction. The raid had proven that American reach was limitless, that audacity could overcome expectation, and that Japan's sense of invulnerability was nothing more than an illusion. By the end of April 18, 1942, the seed of fear had been planted. Japan would never again assume the Americans were passive, distant, or incapable of precise retaliation. For every Japanese pilot who laughed at carrier-based operations or underestimated bomber speed, the raid was a stark reminder. The fight had only just begun, and America's ingenuity was only getting started. Dawn broke across the Pacific, and with it, the world after the Doolittle Raid was irrevocably changed. The Japanese High Command, men who had celebrated Pearl Harbor as proof of their dominance, now sat in disbelief as reports poured in. American bombers had done the unthinkable. They had reached Tokyo. What followed was not merely panic, but a strategic unraveling. Suddenly, defense of the homeland became a priority, forcing Japan to divert resources away from its offensives. The Doolittle Raid was not about bombs alone. It was about forcing Japan to see that America was only at the beginning of its war. In the days following the raid, Tokyo struggled to recover from both the physical and psychological blow. The material damage was limited, several buildings destroyed, fires consuming oil tanks, minor military facilities disrupted, but the symbolic damage was incalculable. For the first time, the Japanese people had felt the sting of vulnerability, and for the first time, the emperor himself faced pressure to address the shaken confidence of his citizens. The raid had forced open a wound that propaganda could not easily heal. Japanese newspapers, heavily censored by the government, attempted to downplay the significance of the attack. They reported minimal damage, reassured the public that countermeasures were in place, and claimed that the Americans had acted out of desperation. Yet, beneath the surface, whispers spread through the population. If the Americans could bomb Tokyo now, what would stop them from returning in greater force? This question lingered like smoke in the air. The military response was immediate and severe. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, recognized the danger at once. He had always feared awakening this sleeping giant of American industry, and now his worst fears were coming true. The Doolittle Raid confirmed what he had suspected. The Americans would not fold under pressure. They would innovate, adapt, and retaliate. Yamamoto ordered a drastic expansion of defensive measures around the Japanese homeland. Radar stations were reinforced, air defenses strengthened, and strategic resources shifted from offensive operations to homeland protection. This shift had profound consequences. Japan, already stretched thin by campaigns across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, now had to allocate ships, planes, and personnel to defend the home islands. Every anti-aircraft gun positioned around Tokyo was one less weapon supporting the front lines. Every fighter squadron pulled back for homeland defense was one less unit pressing Japan's offensive advantage. The raid had forced Japan to divide its strength, a luxury it could ill afford. For the United States, however, the raid was a lightning bolt of morale. Newspapers blazed with headlines. Tokyo bombed. Families who had watched the grim news of Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines now saw proof that America could strike back. The photographs of Doolittle's men, the accounts of their daring mission, became symbols of defiance and hope. In towns across America, children practiced collecting scrap metal and rubber for the war effort with renewed determination. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen looked to the Doolittle Raiders as proof that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, fully aware of the propaganda value, capitalized on the moment. When reporters asked where the bombers had come from, Roosevelt famously replied, "They came from Shangri-La," referencing the mythical paradise. The phrase caught on, fueling the mystique of the mission. Ordinary Americans laughed at the joke, but in Tokyo, the effect was anything but humorous. The uncertainty of America's reach created paranoia. If the bombers could strike from nowhere, then nowhere was safe. Among the Japanese military, the raid ignited heated debates. Some officers demanded harsher measures against Chinese civilians, believing they had aided the American crews who crash-landed. Tragically, these demands led to brutal reprisals. Villages suspected of sheltering Doolittle's men were burned, and thousands of civilians were killed in retaliatory massacres. The cruelty of these reprisals not only tarnished Japan's image, but also deepened Chinese resistance, strengthening the resolve of America's allies in Asia. Meanwhile, the surviving Doolittle Raiders faced their own trials. Some were captured by Japanese patrols and subjected to imprisonment and interrogation. Others, aided by Chinese villagers, evaded capture and made their way back to American lines. Their accounts, once they returned, revealed both the peril they had faced and the heroism of those who had helped them. For the crews, survival was never guaranteed, but their sacrifice had already achieved something far greater than they could have imagined. Within the Japanese Navy, Yamamoto began planning his next move. He understood that America's audacity could not go unanswered. To restore Japanese morale and secure their dominance, he proposed a bold operation: lure the American fleet into battle and crush it in a decisive engagement. That plan would lead to the fateful confrontation at Midway, just weeks later, a battle where the echoes of the Doolittle Raid would still be heard. For Yamamoto, Midway was meant to erase the humiliation of Tokyo's bombing. Instead, it would multiply the consequences tenfold. The Doolittle Raid's genius lay not in destruction, but in redirection. It shifted Japanese strategy, forcing leaders to act defensively instead of pressing their advantage. It exposed the fragility of Japan's industrial and psychological resilience. And it proved, beyond doubt, that America's war effort was fueled by innovation, adaptability, and an iron will to fight back. One Japanese officer, writing in his private journal after the raid, captured the essence of the moment. "We believe the Americans were clumsy giants, slow and hesitant. But they are not clumsy. They are clever, and they are patient. If they can reach Tokyo with so few planes, what will they do with many? For the first time, I fear the war will not end in our favor." The laughter that once echoed in Japanese barracks at the expense of American weakness was gone. In its place grew unease, caution, and the recognition that the war had only begun. By the close of April 1942, the raid had succeeded far beyond its planners' expectations. Japan was rattled, America was emboldened, and the course of the Pacific War began to shift. The bombers had not just delivered explosives, they had delivered a warning, a prophecy of the storm to come. The Japanese military command was shaken to its very core. The unthinkable had happened. American bombers had flown across the Pacific, slipped past defenses, and dropped bombs on the very heart of Tokyo. The Doolittle Raid, though small in scale, reverberated across Japan like a thunderclap. For the first time, civilians who had always believed their islands were untouchable felt the sting of war in their own homeland. Mothers ran into the streets clutching their children, staring at the rising smoke. Families whispered in fear as sirens echoed across Tokyo. And though the physical destruction was limited compared to what Japan itself had unleashed in China, the psychological damage was profound. It was not the bombs themselves that terrified the Japanese leadership, it was the message. America was not broken. America was not retreating. America was only beginning to fight. Within the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito was briefed almost immediately. His generals explained the scope of the attack. 16 bombers, daringly launched from an aircraft carrier, had struck Tokyo and other cities before vanishing. The emperor listened silently, his face grave. To admit vulnerability in the very capital was dangerous, not only to Japan's image abroad, but also to morale at home. The government swiftly moved to control the narrative. Official propaganda declared the damage minimal, emphasizing Japan's ongoing victories in Asia and the Pacific. Newspapers reported the incident, but buried it beneath exaggerated accounts of Japanese triumphs. But privately, military leaders raged. The humiliation was unbearable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood the stakes better than anyone. He had warned Japan's leadership before the war that provoking America might be a fatal mistake. His famous words still lingered. In the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild. But I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. The Doolittle Raid had confirmed his fears. America was not cowed. America was not waiting for Japan to dictate the pace of the war. Instead, America had struck back with audacity, showing both ingenuity and determination. Meanwhile, in the United States, the news of the raid spread like wildfire. For months, Americans had endured a steady stream of defeats: Pearl Harbor, the fall of Guam, the surrender of the Philippines, and the brutal retreat from Wake Island. Headlines had been dominated by loss, pain, and humiliation. But suddenly, there was hope. Newspapers blared with bold headlines. Tokyo bombed. Citizens who had been living under the weight of despair cheered in the streets. The attack may have been militarily minor, but emotionally, it was enormous. It lifted spirits, strengthened resolve, and proved that the United States could strike back. President Franklin D. Roosevelt carefully crafted the announcement, ensuring maximum impact. He famously declared that the bombers had come from Shangri-La, a mythical land, adding an air of mystery and awe to the raid. The secrecy fueled imagination. Where had these planes come from? How had they managed to bomb Tokyo? Ordinary Americans marveled at the daring of their airmen. The pilots themselves, however, were far from celebrating. Most had not made it back to safety. With too little fuel to return to the carrier, they had crash-landed in China or bailed out in the countryside. Some were captured by the Japanese, facing brutal interrogation and execution. Others were aided by Chinese villagers who risked their own lives to shelter them. The cost was heavy, but the legend of the raid was born. In Japan, military leaders debated how to respond. The attack exposed vulnerabilities they had long ignored. Their vast empire stretched across the Pacific, but their defensive perimeter was fragile. If America could launch a raid now, what would happen once their full industrial might was unleashed? The Japanese answer was both swift and fateful. They needed to eliminate America's carrier fleet once and for all. The raid had been launched from carriers, this much was clear. Carriers, not battleships, were the new power of naval warfare. And Yamamoto had already set his sights on a decisive battle. His plan was audacious. He would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap at Midway, a small atoll strategically located between Asia and North America. There, The Japanese Navy would destroy them in a single, crushing blow, securing Japan's dominance in the Pacific. The Doolittle Raid had lit the fuse. Now the Japanese were determined to extinguish the threat before it grew too large. But in trying to erase the humiliation of Tokyo, Japan had unknowingly set itself on a collision course with disaster. As Yamamoto's fleets prepared to sail, American cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had already broken Japanese codes. They knew Midway was the target. They knew Yamamoto's plan. And while Japan still believed America was weak and reeling, the U.S. Navy was quietly positioning itself for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Doolittle Raid had done more than just boost morale. It had reshaped the entire trajectory of the war. Imagine the irony. A raid designed as a bold, symbolic gesture ended up provoking Japan into overreach. Their pride demanded vengeance. Their fear of American carriers pushed them into a reckless gamble. And in the months that followed, at the Battle of Midway, that gamble would cost them dearly. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the very core of their offensive power, would be lost. Thousands of their best pilots would perish. And with that single battle, the tide of the Pacific War would shift forever. But in April 1942, none of this was yet clear. What was clear was the effect of the Doolittle Raid on 2 nations. For Japan, it was a humiliation, a bitter reminder that their war would not be easy. For America, it was a lifeline, a spark of courage that would fuel the long road ahead. As Tokyo smoldered and American newspapers screamed victory, one fact became undeniable. The war had entered a new phase. The Japanese were no longer the hunters. They were being hunted. And the United States, far from defeated, was only beginning to show its true power. The Doolittle Raid was a whisper of things to come. A whisper that grew louder with every passing month, until it became the roar of an unstoppable juggernaut. The spring of 1942 had cracked open a door that neither side could ignore. The Doolittle Raid, bold yet costly, had shifted the war's balance not through destruction, but through psychology. To the Japanese, it was a slap across the face, one that demanded revenge. To the Americans, it was a spark in the darkness, a reminder that even in their weakest hour, they could strike back with audacity. But behind the cheering headlines in the United States, the reality for many of the men who had flown the raid was grim. Those who had parachuted into China faced not just the dangers of the wild terrain, but also the wrath of the Japanese army. Villagers risked their lives to protect the airmen, hiding them in barns, leading them through mountains, and feeding them scraps. The Japanese retaliated with ruthless ferocity, launching reprisals against Chinese towns suspected of aiding the Americans. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered, their homes burned to ash, their loyalty punished with blood. For the survivors, the raid was both a triumph and a haunting memory. Men like Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who had expected the mission to be his last, returned to America as a hero. He was promoted on the spot, draped in the gratitude of a nation. Yet Doolittle himself privately believed the mission had been a failure, that the damage inflicted was too small to justify the losses. Only later did he realize the true weight of his achievement, not in bombs dropped, but in hope restored. In Tokyo, the mood was darker. The Japanese high command struggled with the humiliation of an enemy strike on their home islands. Their carefully constructed image of invincibility had been pierced. The generals and admirals convened in tense meetings, their voices raised, their tempers boiling. If the Americans could hit Tokyo once, they might do so again. It was not simply about damage. It was about prestige. Japan had launched a war built on the belief that their empire was untouchable, shielded by thousands of miles of ocean. The raid shattered that illusion. Ordinary Japanese citizens, who had long believed the war was distant, suddenly saw smoke rising from their own neighborhoods. Whispers spread through Tokyo's streets. If America can do this now, what will they do when their strength grows? To the militarists, there was only one solution: decisive action. They needed to crush the American carriers, the very vessels that had made the raid possible. And so, the plans for Midway began to take shape with renewed urgency. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Roosevelt and his advisors carefully studied the impact. They knew the raid had been small, but they also knew Japan's response would be anything but. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese were preparing a bold move in the Pacific. American codebreakers, working tirelessly in dark rooms, listening to the whispers of intercepted transmissions, began piecing together a puzzle. They learned that Japan was planning something monumental, something meant to wipe the United States Navy off the map. And so, while Japan plotted vengeance, America quietly prepared a trap. But before Midway, there was the matter of the men left behind. Not all of the Doolittle Raiders had made it to safety. Several crews were captured by Japanese forces, dragged before tribunals, and condemned as criminals rather than soldiers. They were starved, beaten, and executed in secret. News of their fate would later reach American shores, igniting fury and deepening the resolve to fight. The Doolittle Raid was no longer just a daring strike. It became a symbol of sacrifice. These men had risked everything, not for territory or conquest, but to remind the world, and their own people, that America had not surrendered. Their courage echoed across the Pacific, fueling every battle that followed. On the ground in China, the consequences grew even more horrific. The Japanese army, enraged by their humiliation, unleashed one of the most brutal campaigns of retribution in the entire war. Cities and villages suspected of aiding the Americans were targeted. Entire communities were massacred, fields were burned, and rivers ran red with blood. Historians would later estimate that 250,000 Chinese civilians died in the reprisals connected to the raid. This was the hidden cost of the mission, a cost borne not by America, but by innocent people halfway across the world. It was a grim reminder that war, even when fought with bravery, leaves scars on those least able to defend themselves. Yet for the Allies, the raid marked a turning point. It signaled that the United States was no longer simply reacting. It was planning, adapting, and preparing to seize the initiative. The Japanese, once seen as unstoppable, had revealed their vulnerability. And that vulnerability would be exploited in the battles to come. By the summer of 1942, both nations were racing toward their destinies. In America, factories thundered with new production. Bombers, tanks, ships, and weapons rolled off assembly lines at a pace never before seen in history. In Japan, leaders pushed their people harder, demanding greater sacrifice, greater loyalty, and greater belief in victory. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. For the Japanese military, the Doolittle Raid was proof that time was not on their side. They had to destroy the American Navy quickly before its growing strength became overwhelming. Their empire depended on it. For the Americans, the raid was proof that boldness could change the course of history. Even a seemingly impossible mission, launching medium bombers from the deck of a carrier, had succeeded. The message was clear: the war could be won. And so, the shadow of the raid stretched over the Pacific. It was present in every decision made by Roosevelt and his generals. It was present in every order given by Yamamoto and his admirals. It whispered in the hearts of civilians on both sides, Americans clinging to hope, Japanese clinging to fear. The Doolittle Raid had been a gamble, one that risked lives for symbolism. But its effects had gone far beyond symbolism. It had reshaped strategy, morale, and the very trajectory of the war. As the carriers prepared to sail toward Midway, and as young pilots climbed into cockpits for missions that would decide the future of nations, the memory of those 16 bombers over Tokyo lingered. Their roar over the Japanese capital had been more than just sound. It had been a prophecy, the prophecy that America was rising, and Japan, though still powerful, was beginning to slip. The war was about to reach a crescendo, and when the ocean boiled with fire at Midway, the echoes of the Doolittle Raid would be unmistakable. The raid had shocked Japan into realizing that the Americans were not finished. They were only beginning to fight. By May of 1942, the echo of the Doolittle Raid had not faded. It had grown louder. Across Japan, it remained a wound, raw and stinging. In the newspapers, propaganda tried to downplay the strike, calling it a minor nuisance. But in the quiet of their homes, Japanese civilians whispered about the American bombers, about the black smoke rising over Tokyo. They whispered about how the emperor himself had been endangered, about how the invincible fortress of the empire had been pierced. In the corridors of power, it was no whisper. It was a roar. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, now found himself under pressure. His bold gamble at Pearl had bought Japan time, but the Doolittle Raid had shown how quickly that time was slipping away. He knew the truth, that America's industrial machine was awakening, that the strike had been less about damage and more about proof. If the Americans could reach Tokyo once, they could do it again. Japan had to destroy the American carriers, the beating heart of their naval strategy. And so, Yamamoto pressed forward with his plan: lure the Americans into a trap at Midway, crush their fleet, and restore Japan's aura of invincibility. The Doolittle Raid, in a sense, had set the stage for one of the most decisive battles of the war. But before Midway unfolded, the men who had carried out the raid were living its aftermath. Those who made it back to American lines were paraded as heroes, their photographs splashed across newspapers, their names spoken with reverence. Yet not all had been so lucky. 8 of the raiders fell into Japanese hands. They were paraded before hostile interrogators, accused of war crimes, and subjected to brutal captivity. 3 were executed by firing squad. Another died slowly in prison. The survivors of captivity were skeletal shadows by the time the war ended. Their suffering was immense, but their sacrifice only magnified the raid's significance. In China, the cost was far worse. The Japanese military, humiliated by the strike, unleashed a campaign of terror across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. They burned villages to ash, executed men, women, and children, and poisoned wells. Historians estimate that more than 250,000 civilians died in the reprisals linked to the raid. These were innocent lives, extinguished in a storm of rage. It was the cruel price of symbolism, the cost borne not by the raiders, but by those who had sheltered them. And yet, despite this horror, the mission's psychological impact could not be undone. The world now knew that Japan was not untouchable. On the other side of the Pacific, in Washington, President Roosevelt recognized the raid for what it was, a turning point. At a time when the Allies were reeling, Singapore fallen, the Philippines collapsing, German forces advancing across Russia, the news of American bombers over Tokyo electrified the public. Headlines screamed of payback, of courage, of defiance. It lifted the nation's spirit in a way no speech could have. Factories redoubled their efforts. Workers, once weary, now labored with new fire. Every rivet hammered into an airplane wing, every shell rolling off an assembly line, carried with it the memory of those 16 bombers that had dared the impossible. Roosevelt's gamble had paid off. The raid was not about damage, it was about will. And what of Japan? The raid had shown cracks in their armor, but rather than slow their march, it accelerated their desperation. Midway was conceived not just as a battle, but as a response, a chance to erase the shame of April 18, 1942. Japan's admirals believed they could draw the American carriers into the open, surround them, and finish them once and for all. But the Americans, armed with broken Japanese codes, knew what was coming. And when the battle unfolded in June 1942, it was Japan, not the United States, that suffered a catastrophic defeat. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of their navy, were sunk. Hundreds of pilots, the elite of their air force, were lost forever. The tide of the Pacific War turned. And in that turning tide, the shadow of the Doolittle Raid loomed. It had been the spark that pushed Japan into the gamble of Midway. Without it, perhaps Yamamoto would have waited, perhaps Japan would have chosen a slower, steadier strategy. But humiliation demanded vengeance, and vengeance led them to ruin. As the years of war dragged on, the memory of the raid lived on in different ways. To the Japanese, it was a scar, a reminder that their empire was not invincible. To the Chinese, it was a tragedy, for they had borne the cruelest punishment. To the Americans, it was a story of audacity, courage, and hope. James Doolittle himself would go on to lead men in Europe and the Pacific, becoming one of the most celebrated commanders of the war. But even in his later years, he often spoke of the raid with humility. He knew its true impact lay not in the buildings destroyed, but in the message it sent.